In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media Sublators, all you slimy commies out there. It's I, Douglas Lane, the CEO of Sublation Media, I guess. I'm not quite sure if I'm actually a CEO. Also, future editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine, author of books like Wave of Mutilation, Last Week's Apocalypse, and Bash Revolution. With me today is Benjamin Studebaker. As always, Benjamin, introduce yourself.
Yes, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, PhD in Politics and International Studies from the University of Cambridge, author of 2 books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way Is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Great. All right. So we were both at the Platypus Affiliated Society convention over the weekend. We participated in various panels. I believe you were on the panel called What Was Neoliberalism? I was on one called Why Does Society Have Politics? I didn't get to go to your neoliberalism panel because I showed up an hour after it had ended. That's when I landed in Chicago. So, Ben, why don't you try to summarize what you experienced on that panel?
Well, I did a weird art piece kind of thing where I interviewed my 22-year-old self and played 2 characters and had a dialogue between them. It was a very strange thing to do on a panel. It was very weird and high concept. People seem to like it, but of course, nobody tells you that they hate what you do. People only come up to you if they liked it, unless they want to argue with you. But what I did was weird, not necessarily something you would argue with. So I think the people who thought it was weird probably just didn't talk to me about it.
Right. That's why it's a good idea, if you're on one of these panels, to say things that are controversial and extreme, because they won't give people an opportunity to just merely dislike what you do. They'll have a reaction, and you'll get both. You'll get people coming up and agreeing possibly, and lots of people coming up to disagree. And I think that's what you want. But on the other hand, if you do what you apparently did, it might stick with them for years to come. It might be something they return to in their mind because it was not what was expected, and a work of art, as you said. So tell me a bit about what your 22-year-old self was like in that dialogue and what you had to say to your younger self.
Well, when I was asked to do that panel, I really wanted to get into what did I think about neoliberalism earlier on, more than 10 years ago when I was first writing about politics. So to do that, I went and looked at my master's thesis from 2014 and went through that argument, revisited it, tried to remind myself, what did I do? Was neoliberalism important to me? What was its role? I only mentioned the word one time in my master's thesis. Only once, which made me inclined to go, was neoliberalism as important a concept to me as maybe it was for other people? And then why would it have been? Why wouldn't it have been?
Yeah. So why wasn't it as important to you as it back then as it was for most of the left, I guess, at that point?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it just became a way of talking about almost everything. It lost any kind of specificity and became kind of unmoored from the economy, especially in the States. People just started applying it to any kind of cultural phenomenon that seemed to them to have something to do with whatever happened in the 70s or 80s. Mm-hmm. So it became a much less effective term. And I really wanted to talk about specific things like capital mobility or free trade or deregulation. Mm-hmm. And when you use a word like neoliberalism, people don't necessarily know that you mean those things because of how widely that word is being applied. And it also seemed to me that a lot of that stuff got rolling before the period that we would recognize as the neoliberal era. GATT, a lot of this stuff was happening in the 40s, in the 50s. So if you don't periodize and you just look at the specific things that you're interested in, then you end up writing a quite different kind of thesis, which on the one hand I did, but also I had some criticisms of my master's thesis. So I also, in the back and forth, kind of argued with myself a little bit about it and tried to convince my 22-year-old self to update it or change it in various ways.
Well, you were writing that thesis around the same time, just before I started at Zero Books. Yeah, I think that's right, because I started at Zero Books towards the end of 2014 and really got going in 2015. And what I recall was, as I started, I was actually interviewing and promoting books I hadn't selected that had come from the previous publishing managers. And there were a number of people, British people, who wanted to claim that different things were neoliberal, like the resilience narrative was a neoliberal narrative, that we were all resilient and we needed to train up our capacity to be resilient. And that the author I spoke to about that claimed that was neoliberal and that we should actually perhaps emphasize our finitude and our weakness and accept that was a part of life and that we needed to organize to protect ourselves rather than simply pretend we could take whatever lumps might come along and persevere. And I'm simplifying, but that was the primary argument being put forward. And my objection at the time was to say, well, why talk about that as neoliberal? Why not just talk about that as a kind of capitalist ideology? Because it seemed to me that asking people to be resilient and, to tighten their belts, to have some gumption and try to survive even in the face of adversity, that had been the message to working people forever, right? So why call it neoliberal? And over the first couple of years, it became clear to me that people were using the word neoliberal as a stand-in for capital or capitalism. So, and that was especially important around that time because we were still in the post-economic crisis of 2008 period. We were still being influenced by the death of Occupy Wall Street. We were still thinking largely, although it was shifting away, in terms of class and economics and structural limits of our society. And by taking aim at neoliberalism, the remedy could become a return to Fordism. It could become a new deal. It could become a Keynesian solution. Whereas if you talked about capitalism, you were placed in a position of not having a clear political project that fit within the bounds of what was already happening. So like it's a matter of difference between, I thought of it at the time, it's difference between paying attention to Richard Wolff or paying attention to someone like David Harvey or the person I really wanted people to pay attention to was Andrew Kleinman, because that's around the time I actually became a member of the MHI. I didn't last very long. But so for me, neoliberalism was a real term that had pointed to real things in the world, but we'd been transformed into being a stand-in for another real term, capitalism, so that you could replace a set of concerns about the particular form of capitalist accumulation and political management you could replace concerns about that for the concerns you might have about the deeper structural inadequacies and contradictions within capitalism itself.
Yeah. That sounds about right to me. I think really it was a stand-in for capitalism, but also many of the people who were using it didn't recognize that it was a stand-in for capitalism and began sloppily using it to refer to any cultural phenomenon that they associated with the 80s or later, or Reaganism or Thatcherism. And in some ways, Reaganism or Thatcherism would have been a little bit more helpful because that would have at least been connected to a policy agenda. But neoliberalism became this word in the academy that people use to conceal their motivations in various ways.
Yes, and it to me, the way that happened seemed to go along with what is sometimes called the cultural turn on the left. So you could be doing a kind of ideology critique, which would be focused on the cultural ephemera that rise up. Alfie Bound wrote a book called it was about Candy Crush and capitalism. I think that's what I'm going to call the book. And it was about how Candy Crush and other kinds of time-wasting games are ideological and help perpetuate capitalism, and perhaps particularly neoliberal capitalism. It was a good book. It was catchy, and it did pretty well. It didn't do huge, but it did all right. And it was like the kind of thing when at the time when people would ask me, "Wait a minute, you're 0 books. What is that? What do you publish?" I would say, "Well, we recently published a big thick book examining the musical legacy of David Bowie. Oh, and we published this book called Candy Crush and Capitalism." And people go, "Oh, I get it. I know what that is." But it was a tricky period where we were trying to actually walk away from this cultural turn, and I was trying to get 0 books to be properly Marxist, and that was, it didn't end up being completely easy, especially after Trump got elected. It became more difficult, but that was the point of it. That was the point of my endeavors at 0 books, and I do recall the question of neoliberalism being a point of ideological battle. I wrote many inflammatory things saying these Democrats need to stop talking about neoliberalism instead of capitalism. So
it started off as a way of talking about capitalism without talking about capitalism. And then it became a way of not talking about capitalism while seeming to be talking about it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that happened. But now we're at this point where it looks like it's conceivable that we're finally seeing the end of neoliberalism. I remember after the economic crisis, I think it was Alan Greenspan who said, "Yeah, my ideology was wrong. I just didn't think this could ever happen." And he was like the neoliberal. It's just like, yeah, it doesn't work after all. And there was a feeling as though, as Obama was taking office, that the neoliberal order needed to end. He was going to be the return to the New Deal. He was promising to be the next FDR, and even as he was not at all actually promising that, like he was very clearly, he's also saying, "My favorite president is Ronald Reagan." And positioning himself to the right of at least Edwards in that race, but nonetheless, in the left's imagination, he was going to be the FDR figure. And so I have been expecting the end of neoliberalism since 2008. And now it seems like it's happening. Of course, Chris Catrone has argued that Trump will usher this in. That's from Why Not Trump on. He's been arguing that that's what Trump is about. And, it's conceivable. And as I try to take it seriously, then the idea of neoliberalism as a cultural phenomenon comes back, because it comes back through the university battles, the way in which some of our so-called radical philosophies have been are in crisis, and have also been shown to actually have been ushering in and supporting neoliberalism. My relationship with and appropriation of David Shields is all about trying to re-examine what was radical, what was progressive about postmodern skepticism, and also examine how that is in crisis right now. So that's what I'm doing with David Shields. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, neoliberalism, if it means just capitalism in the form that it takes after the wars and the Bolshevik Revolution and the Depression, given all of those things, given the technological change and the transformations that have occurred since then, it's the return of capitalism in those conditions. If that's the case, then of course neoliberalism can't be ending, because it's just capitalism after the war, capitalism in the conditions of more recent contemporary history. So to say that neoliberalism is ending, you would have to say that it means something else. And then this moves you back toward that kind of fluffy cultural conceptualization of neoliberalism that I never liked. So I have a tendency to push on the Plats when they say things like neoliberalism is ending, going, well, now you're conceding the bad, fluffy cultural usage of neoliberalism that I never liked very much.
No, like I completely understand your point of view in that regard, because as I said, when people were using neoliberalism in this fuzzy way to refer to anything that was happening in the culture, really, that they didn't like, I objected, and I saw it as a way to avoid the question of capitalism itself. And yet, it does seem to me that there were some cultural phenomenon, and that maybe another way to think about it isn't neoliberalism, but de-industrialization and the kind of post-ideology era, which the end of class struggle, all of that seems to be in crisis right now. The Daniel Bell's approach to understanding American society is in crisis right now, and in that way, there was a neoliberal turn, but it was not only, couldn't be reduced only to deregulation and taxation and a shifting of subsidies from broad subsidies to keep all Americans' living standards, or most Americans' living standards, relatively high, but rather to prop up industries and instead, and to try to ease the process of capital accumulation, which is how I think of neoliberalism mostly. But if you but you accept that's what it was, but then all these attendant cultural phenomena came along with it, including de-industrialization, which had its own ideology attached to it. So if we really are trying to re-industrialize the United States, then the neoliberal ideology might be ending. Am I being too flat-footed here?
Isn't this more helpful to talk about something like de-industrialization? That's something discrete. Now we can talk about whether that's going to end. And it's clear what we're talking about. So most of the time when the term neoliberalism comes into the picture, its function is to make it harder for us to understand what we mean and to have a conversation.
True. Okay. Yeah. But maybe because I'm a novelist and, in a kind of artist, I like thinking about how, for instance, a document like Learning from Las Vegas emerged alongside deindustrialization and was kind of a consequence of that turn. How Googie architecture even reflects the collapse of ambitions that the post-ideological age were insisting upon. And then
there's the end of history. The end of history I would distinguish from neoliberalism, right? Because the end of history is a quite specific feeling
Yeah.
And we could have a whole debate about that, and it could be separate and distinct from a debate about deindustrialization. We could have industrialization come back without getting rid of the end of history. Or we could have the end of history come back without getting rid of deindustrialization. So once we start to go, okay, neoliberalism can be all these different discrete things, then we can start talking about each of them and what's happening with each of them, and whether we think the constellation of different things that is emerging is sufficiently different that we ought to come up with a name for it.
Okay, but the end of history, which I think in your telling would have started with Daniel Bell in the late 50s, early 60s, right? The end of ideology.
Well, I would put that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the second system.
Right. I was just about to say the actual essay by Fukuyama emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's this economic way in which ideology was overcome through deindustrialization and the information age, and the notion that we're all classless and free, which turned into over time, we're all part of the gig economy. We're all part of the creative class. There's that. And then there's the end of history, which is the end of political struggles, the end of ideological contests on the level of states, and the division between East and West, and the end of socialism as a prospect.
Yet this question about, is there going to exist, does there exist, or is there going to exist a second world as opposed to a first and a third?
Mm-hmm.
The second world is gone. Is the second world back? Is China leading, or can it lead a second world system? Right? That's a quite specific question that we could ask.
Mm-hmm. But let's say we say no, there isn't, the second world's not coming back.
Then history hasn't ended. We're still in a unipolar moment then. So multipolarity hasn't happened.
You mean
so all these
hasn't,
things?
You mean history hasn't returned because the unipolar moment?
Excuse me. Yeah. History hasn't returned because there's still no alternative to the world system led by the United States. So
right,
we don't have that kind of contestation.
Right, but I think it's important to see the parallel between Daniel Bell and Fukuyama, the parallel between the end of ideology domestically, and not just in the United States, but amongst the working class around the world, and then the end of history as a political contest between different states, which represent the ideologies of the working class in different ways. So like the end of the working class and class politics. Okay.
I want to say that the ideologies come from a robust sense of interstate competition. And when the Soviet Union fades as a competitor and ceases to seem like it offers a live alternative, that's when ideology begins to lose its force. And the Soviet Union ceased to be a compelling alternative before it collapsed. So in some sense, history ended before it ended, insofar as the Soviet Union ceased to be a real vehicle for offering a compelling alternative vision. And that's why there was that brief period where they all became Maoists and tried to make the third world the alternative so that they could still keep some level of ideological contestation going. But they had to go to the third world because the second world made them cry too much. They were too upset about the conditions in the second world to champion it, and therefore had to pivot to becoming Maoists. And then, of course, the failure of Maoism to catch on any level leaves you in a situation where you genuinely don't have any other option that has any kind of compelling pull.
Well, I would just point to the New Left and also the various class struggles within socialist countries in the middle of the 20th century as a counter to your story, because I would say that there was a force in global society that was still ideological and struggling for socialism that couldn't be defined only by blocks of nations or by any given nation, but rather was defined by the class position or the class orientation, or and perhaps more importantly, the ideological orientation of the people involved. So you had
Yeah,
a
but this is
struggle to
what's really
contain.
sad about the 20th century. In the 20th century, if your ideology isn't attached to a state that seems like it's a contender, it doesn't have legs. In the 19th century, there was ideological contestation within and among all of the different states. It was not clear in the 19th century which state was dominant. There was real competition, but it was a multipolar competition among a lot of different states, all trying different things in an imperialist system. So a very live environment with people in all the different states coming up with all kinds of wild ideas about what they could do to make their particular society more advanced. But by the 20th century, it's all interstate competition. And if you're not appendage to a state that looks like it can win, then you don't have a seeming plausibility. So there are people intellectually and there are people culturally who would make arguments, but there was an inability to get traction in the mid 20th century if you weren't attached to a player. And that's part of what was sad about it, because it was the statification of all of this.
Right. But I would just say that the Hungarian Revolution, say, which did influenced and inspired the creation of a new left, while it failed, still was thought at the time to point to an alternative path towards socialism against that statification, and that was one of the ideas that inspired C. Wright Mills, for instance, to write the letter to the New Left. That was one of the reasons why C.L.R. James came along and with right Dostoevsky critiqued the Soviet Union and came up with the Forrest Johnson or the Johnson-Forrest tendency. I can't remember. I never get that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There was that short period where they were trying to revitalize the Second World. And I think there were some people who hung on to that even quite late in the Cold War period. This idea that the Second World could be revitalized, that something could happen that would help the Second World find its way.
Mm-hmm. But that revitalization of the Second World was not about improving the states or reinvesting in the really existing socialist bloc, but rather was about both in the West and in the East revitalizing a working class civil society struggle.
Yeah, there was an internationalist horizon. But of course, by the time that you're doing that in the 50s, the possibility of that really coming to happen has really closed up quite a bit. You have this Stalinized Soviet Union, which really can't plausibly lead some kind of international anymore. You have the Sino-Soviet split. So, now you've got fracturing even within what would seem to have been socialism. It became just very, very difficult by that point. But yes, there were still some remaining bits and bobs of people trying throughout that period, but in an increasingly distressed way.
I don't disagree with any of that. But then the question of neoliberalism rises up in my mind again. Like, why are we talking about this when we started asking about neoliberalism, what neoliberalism is? And,
because we're talking about the structure of the world system,
right?
Which I think is where we need to go when we start talking about a concept like this,
right?
But it isn't where we typically go,
right? Okay, but if we can say that the neoliberalism is ending, and we're socialists who are looking for opportunities to revitalize that civil society struggle to overcome capitalism that the New Left thought was at least possible after the Hungarian Revolution, say, then at least I'm being led. Maybe I'm being led to repeat the same mistakes. Maybe I'm just being led to.
I wonder if on some level, it sounds like you kind of want the post-war era back in this conversation.
Yeah, like I want the 50s and 60s back. You're saying.
And the
Right.
possibilities that the 50s and 60s seem to kick up.
Well, okay. When it comes to my cultural, uh, predilections, like what do I most admire? I probably just want like the 60s and 70s back, or something like, Lenny Bruce, and if the Beatles through the Sex Pistols or some shit. And it doesn't matter what I want. But
No, but what about the 50s?
Because I can get that anytime I want now, right? I can just load those things up whenever. But like when it comes to what political opportunities I'm looking for, I am turning to 50s and 60s to try to find a model or see what might have happened and was available, or what people thought was on the table then. And that also probably speaks to the fact that I am the product of the 70s and 80s. And so my first contact with the left was through these anti-Bolshevik dissidents against the Soviet system, like Guy Debord and others, Henri Lefebvre and so forth. And so that may be, and which means really ultimately my first understanding, the way I came to the left, was through the New Left, was through that post-Hungarian Revolution New Left that was attempting to be critical of, the United States and the Soviet Union. So
then we can ask, what were the conditions that allowed people in the 50s to have those kinds of thoughts and to have that kind of horizon? And is it the case that what's happening now would produce conditions that would give rise to those horizons? So I think one of the things that was going on in the 50s and 60s is that there was crazy high growth, which led people to think that perhaps if the growth continued, or if it had an exponential quality even, enormously wonderful things could become possible within a quite short span of time. I think that was a major factor.
Well, you are putting your finger on something for sure, and it's not hidden. It's not hidden in what I say. It's not hidden in what Chris Catrone says or what the Platts are hoping for. That there is a hope that this rhetoric around onshoring and making America great again will actually lead to at least a short period of growth and proletarianization, and that we could that the left could conceivably take advantage of that period, because proletarianization is always double-edged. It's always contradictory. So it will be, for many, a way to find employment and stability, but it will also require the diminishing of expectations for others, and maybe for the same people, because people who are, this is my imagination here, we see the university system as we know it now get unwound, start to collapse. It becomes an elite institution again, and not trying to usher in and manage the de-industrialized world. So, and the trade schools rise up, and the expectation is you're going to go work in a factory, or you're going to go work in a manufacturing center, or you're going to go work in a call center, or you're going to go work in a data mine, or I'm old, so I don't even know all the options. But the point is that you're going to go be a worker. You're going to be proletarianized, which means that promise of an education and the liberty that comes along with it, the self-determination that should come along with being a highly educated person, part of the political class through the college system, the university system, that's being taken away, which will mean that on the one hand, you'll have perhaps increased stability, less precarity amongst most of the population, and at the same time, diminished expectations and a sense of loss. What could be better for us? What could be better than that?
I think the thing that people don't pay enough attention to, political people, and this is going to come from having a dad who wrote magazines about factories, editor-in-chief of plant services and control, and about process automation. When the jobs come back, they come back with an order of magnitude fewer jobs.
Yeah.
each factory that you would get back for the same production, you're talking about 1/10 the labor force that you would have needed in the 60s and 70s. So even in a situation where all the jobs come back, they would come back in this diminished form. And the ones that would have the highest job footprint, those are the ones that are most likely to go to one of the states that cuts a trade deal with Trump in the next couple of months.
Right.
Those are the states that are most likely to get the really high labor footprint jobs. So I don't really see a possibility of it producing a huge number of jobs in the States, even if a big chunk of the manufacturing does in fact come back and the United States does reindustrialize. I think it would do it without the jobs footprint that we would associate with that.
Well, there's the jobs that would be actually, I mean, look, I don't disagree that automation will diminish the amount of employment that onshoring would bring. Obviously, that's true. And you've got the numbers probably completely right. 10% of what it would have been before. Okay, I'll accept that. But there are jobs that are created around productive centers of capital accumulation as well. So you can't,
yeah, you're like the old Studebaker plant in South Bend with the 40,000 jobs can materialize a city of 100,000 people on that basis. So
right.
Yeah, you certainly can support a certain number of additional jobs. And also, you might have to produce more than you did in the 70s. So even if it's 1/10, maybe you have to produce twice as much as you would have done in the 70s. So maybe it becomes 20% of the jobs rather than 10% on the basis of an increase in the total amount you need to produce. I still don't think that quite solves the problem. And because it doesn't, I think that there will still be a lot of people going into the university system and trying to use a university degree to get some kind of advantage. So I don't think the universities are going to fold up. I do think they're going to be enshittified, though. They're going to become places where you really can't get any kind of elite education. You can only get an education that might allow you to do marginally better than a regular factory worker.
Yeah, but even under those conditions, we might be seeing a return of the question of class, at least in some segment of the population, in a way that Daniel Bell would not expect, right? That itself could be the partial ending of neoliberalism.
Even if you could get back to only 20% of the population goes to college as opposed to 40%.
Yeah.
You still have this big cohort of millennials, which is demographically a very large generation, educated at that much higher rate, that you're still going to have in the population and voting and causing all kinds of trouble for a good 50, 60 more years. And then, even if you were to get it down to 20%, that would be your university percentage that you had at the end of the 70s, in the early 80s. That was still a percentage that was compatible with attempts at nominating George McGovern or Walter Mondale. It was still a chunk of the population that was large enough to become confused about its level of influence and to try things in the 80s that were not politically feasible on the basis of a confused subjectivity and an alienation and estrangement from the rest of the working class.
Well, what Mark Corbin Wilson says, rebuilding the infrastructure would create more jobs. Transportation infrastructure and healthcare require workers. What do you make of that addition to?
I wonder if they're really going to build the transportation infrastructure. One of the things we talked about last time with the Abundance book is how they just want to build these towers in these cities. And then they want these 15-minute cities where all of the stuff is nearby and you don't have to have a car. It seems to me like they're really trying to avoid having to build transportation infrastructure. And when they did that big infrastructure bill under Biden, it contained a remarkably small amount of real, serious transportation infrastructure relative to its size. It was full of all kinds of other stuff that didn't have any kind of obvious relationship to transportation infrastructure. And I wonder if we can get another infrastructure bill. That doesn't even seem to be on the table now, maybe in the next administration, they might return to this. But it seems to me like they really struggled even to get the infrastructure build that they got. And the amount of transportation it's actually going to build is pretty limited in scope.
I think in a kind of crudely Marxist way, or in maybe an economic way, it seems to me that if you're going to have massive infrastructure spending, you're going to want to do that in the service of capital accumulation. And if you build roads, but they don't go to, they're not being used to transport goods or to bring workers to work, then why are you spending the money, and how can you justify it? The infrastructure has to be in the service of building up the economy of a capitalist accumulation. Otherwise, it's just deficit spending, just creating more of the problem, and it will also, because it just won't be properly motivated to fully arrive anyway.
Yeah, and this is one interesting possibility. Could you get factories that are located in places that are not, major cities like San Francisco and New York? And could that spur a certain amount of infrastructure spending related to those places? I think a certain amount, but we won't get these cities materializing out of thin air around factories like we did in the 50s.
Okay.
Because there just won't be enough of a jobs footprint to do that.
Right, which again, if we're seeing the diminishment of the significance of the cities, especially on the coast, say, and a rebuilding of rural, flyover country America, I mean, that goes all hand in hand with, that seems natural given the outcomes in the last election, right?
We could see some towns get built, and there could be some infrastructure spending related to the building of towns with something like maybe a factory gets built, it employs, 1,000 people, and then you might have a town of, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 around that. We could see some of those. It wouldn't surprise me if we saw some of those, but I don't know if that is enough to have the macro level effect that you're looking for in your account.
Probably. Well, we'll see, I guess, is the answer to that. I want to address one more comment here. Platypus members rarely, if ever, use the term neoliberalism to mean something cultural. This is a bizarre straw man. Okay, so I want to address this and say
they use it for ideology. They use it to talk about the ideology, which of course has cultural components.
Right, exactly. The Platypus affiliated society understanding of society of the world is not limited to this economistic approach that maybe a lot of vulgar Marxists take up. They are interested in the Frankfurt School. They take the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer very seriously. Those people are often blamed, I think, unfairly for this cultural turn that came later. They got lumped in with post-Marxist thinkers through the academy. But I'm holding on to the distinction between the Frankfurt School as actual Marxists and those who, like Foucault or Derrida or whoever, who I would
or even the later generations of the Frankfurt School. There's Adorno, and then there's Habermas, and then there's what comes later. Yeah, I find it interesting how sometimes when you point out something that goes on in Platypus, the attempt to defend Platypus would actually weaken the position if you were to take it up. The fact that Platypus wants to talk about ideology is not at all a bad thing. It's just that the term, because of how it's used in the academy, is used very confusingly. So when the term gets raised in the context of a panel, it doesn't necessarily help us get at this very specific dynamics that I think we really want to be talking about. Like, why can't Platypus ask a question like, are we going to see a reindustrialization of the United States, and what would the consequences of that be? Or are we going to see a return of history or a return of multipolarity? And what would the consequences of that be? The stuff that would be more specific, we don't tend to discuss as much.
I think I can I've gotten close enough to Platypus now I can partially answer that question. Maybe I'll be glad to be corrected by someone who's actually a member. And I was actually told that I'm not allowed to be a member by the head of the Portland chapter.
Did you try to join?
No, I just said I tried to get into an internal meeting, and they told me I wasn't to be in there. And and for good reasons. And then I said, well, maybe I'll join. You don't know. It's for prospective members. I could possibly join. And it, kind of giving me a ribbing. Wong said, no, your kids can join, but you are not allowed. So I was like, fine. But anyway, I am close enough, I think, to be able to partially answer the question you just raised. With why can't they ask that? It's because the Platypus Affiliated Society is not a positive political project. They're not developing a line. They're not actually trying to address the world of capitalism. They are instead intervening negatively on the left. So they're only interested in what the actually existing left, the dead left, is doing and how it's responding. So they don't ask themselves questions in there. For the few minutes I was in that internal meeting, they were not asking themselves, what do we expect will happen after these tariffs are implemented to the working class or to the overall global economy? They were asking questions like, well, what is this neo-Stalinist turn on the left? Where do we think the left will be going next?
See, is that really the most helpful thing, to be like obsessing over the Zoomers on the Ivy League campuses who have gotten into Stalinism? Is that, I wonder if maybe it would be more helpful. I know it's different from what they have typically done, but it might be more helpful to just have a real, let's actually talk about manufacturing and what does it involve now? And can it have the effects people are imagining? And, what would it look like? I think some of this would just help in terms of people's understanding of the situation.
Well, let's talk about my panel, because I think what happened on my panel and what I was trying to do is an answer in a way to your questions. Is what they're doing really necessary? Is what Platypus, could they be more useful? And I think that what they're doing is necessary. And I think what I tried to do on that panel was necessary. It doesn't mean it's sufficient. It just means it's necessary. And all I was really trying to do on my panel was inform the young people and the non-plats in the audience, however many there might have been, that Bill Ayers should be told no. And that's all I was trying to do. I was not trying to lay out an alternative to Bill Ayers fully. I was actually trying to leave that as open as possible because I don't think I have a fully worked out alternative to Bill Ayers exactly. But I wanted to point out the deficiencies in that approach to the left as clearly and as strongly as I could. And that's all I did on that. I really neglected David and Alex when I was in that. I was just going after Bill.
You were very witty. You had some great one-liners. You were very much on your game, and the fencing was very entertaining. I had a good time watching your panel. Mm-hmm. I did find myself wanting some of Dave's points about the sack of potatoes to get engaged, because that was closer to this question of society and politics, particularly now. Dave was talking about how these things relate now and what's going on now. And I think if we tarried a little bit with what's going on now, then you might be able to say something to Ayers beyond no. But in part because nobody really wants to think about now because they find it depressing. If they take it too seriously, they can only think about now if they put some cope over it and they make some assumptions that are convenient.
Yeah, like I was doing for every other part of this stream.
Well,
maybe.
everybody's doing it. It's not a you problem. It's a history problem. The contemporary period is hard and difficult and painful to think about, and people don't want to do it for that reason. So, the sack of potatoes point, I really thought that was something that should have been taken up. And I was saddened that people didn't. But I respect what you were looking to do with respect to Ayers. It was very funny and very entertaining.
Well, here's what I'll say about what I understood the sack of potatoes point to be, right? And it was actually something that might have come up that I might have, talked to David about if I had a chance to get through my entire presentation. I only got through about 3/4 of it. There was
because they cut your time. Why did they reduce you guys to just 10 minutes? That's too short.
Yeah, I had something to say about uh, what civil society organizing would look like today, which was the last question that I didn't get to answer. And it does relate to this notion of being a sack of potatoes, right? In other words, I think the millennial left treated the working class and society overall as if they were just a sack of potatoes. They were useless, except maybe to be moved around by the state. And it was, there was some regret that they had to go this route, but that was a starting assumption of the millennial left as defined by Jacobins. It's like, well, we just can't. Civil society is too broken. The people are too.
See, this would
up.
have been great. This would have been
Yeah.
an amazing argument about, at the core, what do we have? Do we have a society or do we have a sack of potatoes? To what degree do we have a Hobbesian multitude? Do we still live in a world that looks like something that could be described with Rousseau? Or do we have post-class, fractured mass, so a return to something that looks like a Hobbesian multitude? That's a huge fundamental question. And the answer to that fundamentally would shape whatever it is that we would do. And there was no going into that.
The assumption of the campaign is we still live in a society. We're siding with the Joker, right? We live in a society. We don't live in a sack of potatoes.
That's a huge difference between you two, that I would love to see that litigated. That the trouble is that sometimes in Platypus, they fail to follow a basic rule, which is that you should at least give people 12 minutes and maybe as much as 15, but certainly not 10. 10 is too short.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I felt like it went well enough, and I did feel like I would have liked to get to the end of my presentation. But probably another person who should take some blame is me, because I was so focused on Bill Ayers that I failed to pick up on what David was saying and respond to him.
That's not your fault. Anybody who's sitting right next to Bill Ayers, this is a guy who's 80 years old. Your chances to do that with Bill Ayers are limited. Anybody sat next to Bill Ayers, I can perfectly understand them doing what you did. And it was their decision to stick Bill Ayers on that panel. So
right. But they were disappointed. I heard afterwards that the conversation didn't turn to exactly what we're talking about now.
Well, that was their fault for putting Bill Ayers on the panel. If you're going to put Bill Ayers on the panel, it's going to become about Weather Underground.
Right.
Of course. If you want a conversation about society and politics, you don't go to an 80-year-old man and ask him to have an abstract conversation. This is stuff that he thinks he worked out back in the 60s. He's not going to do what you... This should have been obvious to them.
Yeah, but I was glad that Bill Ayers was there nonetheless.
Of course, because it's a riot. It's very entertaining. Yeah, but they'll say on the one hand they want it to be fun, and then on the other hand they want to have a conversation about society and politics. Come on. Sometimes these things pull in different directions, and you have to make a difficult choice.
But okay, so there's some limits to what happened there with that particular panel, and perhaps with yours as well. We didn't really get to any gripes about your panel, but what I did see happen after, like the next day, I actually had conversations with younger Platypus members who come up, just a few. He came up to me and said, "I'm really confused. I don't know, is Platypus worth anything anymore? Should we all just be joining the campaign? There's a feeling like, oh, there's sublation and there's Platypus, and you have to choose somehow within some of the younger members. I wouldn't say everyone." And my response was, no. Like, we will be trying to develop a positive political project. It is not political yet. It is still pre-political. That we're atomized activists trying to, in the name of socialism, find and participate in society, in what's happening. That's not just a sack of potatoes. That's what we assume, and I think we can safely assume, is actually ongoing all the time. If in churches, if nowhere else, and there are still remnants of these old civil society organizations. They come up and they get to smash, and they come up. So that's what the campaign's doing. What the Platypus Affiliated Society is doing is saying to leftists who would like to organize for socialism, there are a lot of things you need to reject. And what I did on the panel with Bill Ayers was in that vein. It's like I was just communicating there are things to say no to, and here's one of them.
I think we've reached a stage where the campaign needs its own panels. There should be Platypus panels, and then the campaign should have panels, because the level of thinking that is necessary to actually have a response to the contemporary situation requires real, serious, hard thinking about that contemporary situation.
I would like it if there was a panel that Platypus dedicated to the question of the campaign, but I don't require it, and I understand why they might be reluctant to do so. I think if the campaign were to be successful in the next 2 to 3 years, there would be possibly a need for a convention for the campaign, rather than
or for the campaign to hold panels in particular areas where there's a sufficient density of people. That could be one of the things that the campaign does. Since the campaign is pre-political, having robust discussions about what it might mean now to be political and what form that could take. But we do this parrot room thing afterwards where we have this kind of conversation, but not within the framework of a panel, which might, I think, to some degree, raise it up.
Yeah. Well, we can't have a panel every time I put out a podcast, but
that's too often.
Right. But I do think that if we tried to build something that was like a convention where we put on panels, or just have panels that we put on, because the Platypus doesn't only do panels at their big convention; they have panels in every city.
Right.
So I think that would be worthwhile, and we could have the conversation: are we a sack of potatoes, or are we a society? And I and I know that David and the Theory Underground crew are wanting to be more than a sack of potatoes. That's what their whole project is about, is trying to, as individuals, build themselves up and find the time, energy needed to be part of a society again, rather than simply be treated like commodities, which is what labor is. So yeah, I would want to collaborate with Theory Underground on a panel around these topics. But I would just say, like, if someone were to come to me to one of these writers' workshops, in fact, it's already happened, and say, oh, I want to learn about Marxism, I would say, well, we have our lecture series that reads Attempting to Begin, and we have, we talk about Marxism all the time. But if you want to be rigorously educated, go join the Platypus Reading Group. It meets at the PSU library every Monday. And I'm going to be at the coffee social on Wednesday. We come to that because I think the Platypus Affiliate Society is absolutely necessary, even as a positive political project is trying to develop.
Sure. People should be able to hold these things both in their head at the same time. There can be a use for positive and negative stuff at the same time. You don't have to pick.
Right. But for a long while, the most of the positive attempts that were being made were overly ambitious. They got ahead of themselves, and in the process, they became statified. Is how I would put it, and I would say that the modesty of the Campaign for a Socialist Party is one of its strengths. The fact that it's not attempting to be immediately a political party is its strength, and that and so that I'm going to claim in my arrogant way that sublation and the Campaign for a Socialist Party represents a path forward for the left that did not form after the economic crisis of 2008. That people wanted to form, they made an attempt to form, but it ultimately failed. We're setting out to try again, trying to learn from not just the millennial left, but the Gen X left, whatever that was, and the new left as well, and even earlier than that. So shall we wrap it up there and in about 20 minutes go to the Zoom call on Patreon? Okay.
Yeah, that seems about right.
Yeah. All right. So everyone who's watching, if you wanted to join in on a big conversation on Zoom, It'll start in about 20 minutes over on the Patreon. You should be able to find the link. And thank you very much for watching.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people